When I started my journey into the 3D world, the rendering settings were causing me constant nightmares. For years, I wouldn't utterly understand what its setting was doing. I had found a combination that was giving me a nice result and I would stick to it. But believe me, this is not the right approach. You see, with rendering, it is always a fine balance between quality and time. You need to understand what its setting does and how it affects both those aspects, otherwise, you might end up doing test renders for several hours. So, we will start our course explaining what does rendering settings mean, which are the most important settings, and we will see how we adjust them to produce draft and final renders. What are the rendering settings? They are mainly algorithms that calculate effects not displayed in the editing environment due to their complexity. To make myself clear, this is the editing environment of 3ds Max. We see a floor plan, the elevations of our project and the perspective view. And based on this perspective, here is the render we will get. So our render has lighting, shadows and all the materials are displayed with their attributes, with reflections, bump effects and so on. So in order to go from this to that, we need to hit the render button. So why two people can have exactly the same scene and produce two different results? Let's say these two. Because of the rendering settings. Before we hit the render button, we need to go and adjust them. So, let's start. Open the file renderingsettings.max. I have placed the camera, a sunlight, artificial lighting and materials, so what you see here is basically the full final scene. To access the rendering settings, go to the menu Rendering and choose Render Setup. Or click this button, Render Setup. Or press F10 on your keyboard. 3ds Max and V-Ray have several rollouts with commands. I will focus only on the settings that I believe are vital to control the quality of your images and the rendering time. In order to use V-Ray, we must first select it as our renderer. At the top of the render setup window, make sure production rendering mode is selected as the target and then choose V-Ray 5 as the renderer. If you only use V-Ray as a rendering engine in all your projects, then you can set it as your default renderer to avoid repeating this step every time you start a new project. To do so, go to the menu Customize and choose Custom UI and Default Switcher. Go to the Initial Settings for Tool Options and choose Max.V-Ray. Click Set and restart 3ds Max for the changes to take effect. If this is your first experience with V-Ray, then consider yourself lucky, because in this version of V-Ray, we keep almost all the default rendering settings. So if you are using older versions, I advise you to upgrade. Things are simpler now and more improved. Before going into further details in the rendering settings, it is important to first understand how V-Ray Frame Buffer works. V-Ray Frame Buffer is a window that displays the rendering progress and gives us full control over the rendered output. It allows us to review, post-process and save the render. To produce a render, choose one of the following options. Go to the menu Rendering and choose Render. Click on the Render Production button from the main toolbar. Press Shift and Q. When the rendering process starts, 3 windows appear in your screen. V-Ray Frame Buffer, V-Ray messages and the rendering window. The rendering window shows the progress of the render. More specifically, next to the current task you see two brackets. The first one shows the rendering time in real time, while the second bracket estimates the total time needed for the render to be completed. Below the current task is a progress bar that displays a green color that serves as a visual aid of the progress of the render. Once the render is produced, the rendering window disappears. There are two buttons in the rendering window, Stop and Cancel, and they both serve to abort the rendering process. The progress of the render can also be viewed at the bottom of the V-Ray frame buffer window. The V-Ray messages window gives us updates on the rendering process, and if something goes wrong, you will see a warning or error in front of the message to go and fix it. And now let's go to the V-Ray frame buffer window. It consists of the main view, this one, where the render unfolds, and these two side panels. The left panel is the render history, where we can save, load, and compare renders. The right panel hosts the layers, which allow us to do layer compositing and fine-tune the render. Use the handles that divide each part to resize or collapse it. If we double-click on a handle, we hide and reappear the respective part. Rescale the V-Ray frame buffer by clicking and dragging the edges of the window. The layers allow us to adjust the rendered image by applying color corrections and other effects. Some of the most useful are: the exposure control includes three different settings: the exposure, the highlight burn, and the contrast. To enable the exposure controls, click on Create Layer and choose Exposure. Go to its properties. Exposure allows us to make the rendered image brighter or darker. You can either slide the cursor or type a value. A value of +1 makes the image twice as bright, while -1 makes it twice as dark. So if we set the exposure value to -2, the image gets darker, giving the feeling it is dusk. Let's put the exposure back to 0. Do you see here these parts of the image that are rendered overexposured, like the sun burns them? Highlight burn controls these parts, the highlights of the render. The lower we scroll, the less intense the bright areas of the render will be. And now the areas no longer look burned. Contrast is the ratio between the white and the black, or in other words, the light and the dark parts of the scene. Don't overdo it with this setting because it can destroy the image. Do you see that here? I usually set contrast to 0.1 to make the image pop up, have more depth. Click on the Create Layer button and choose White Balance. Then scroll down to its properties. White balance is a photographic term and refers to the process of removing any color cast or tint from our photos. If all the lights that you are using have a white color, then you probably won't need to adjust the white balance. But if you are like me, who loves warm lighting, I always set my lights to 3500 Kelvin, then you always have to adjust the white balance, otherwise it's like there is an orange filter on our render. Can you see that here? All the rendering is very warm, very orange or yellowish. How does white balance work in V-Ray? Go to the temperature slider and slide to the left to make your render colder, or to the right to make it warmer. In our example, we need to set the temperature approximately to 5000 Kelvin. How do you understand when to stop sliding? You always need to have a white color as a reference and make sure that your object renders pure white. What do I mean by that? In my example, the ceiling is supposed to be a white color. When the temperature is set to 6500 Kelvin, which is the default value, they don't render white, but they have an orange hue. So, I start sliding to the left, and at approximately 5000 they turn into white. And so, I am good to stop. Be careful, because if you slide a lot, they will start turning into a light blue color. So make smooth movements and stop when necessary. Curves allow us to adjust the contrast of the image. So you would normally ask now, why use curves and not the contrast setting we saw earlier? And the answer is because with the curves we have better control over the contrast, and we will see that now. Click on the Create layer and choose Curves. This one is kind of tricky, let's say. Let me adjust the size of the Curves window to have better overview of this panel. We see two red dots, one placed at 0 by 0 and the other one at 1 by 1. Click on the bottom left red dot and a red line appears. Click and drag the upper end of this red line and move it slightly downwards and to the right. The contrast of the render increases and the dark areas become darker. Then click on the upper right red point and another red line appears. Click and drag this white dot now and move it slightly upwards and to the left. The contrast of the render increases and the bright areas become brighter. At the end, you want the curve to form a light S. Don't overdo it, please, because it is easy to destroy your render. We want smooth movements, small adjustments, okay? If I click on the eye icon next to its setting, I disable it and re-enable it. So, do you see the difference before and after the adjustments we made? And now, there is one last layer that I would like to show to you. This one is automatically added as a layer, but by default it is disabled. Click on the lens effects and go to the properties. Check the Enable Bloom Glare effect, and the glare effect is automatically added to all the lights in the scene. To control the glare effect, adjust the size and the intensity values. In all these layers that we just reviewed, there are not right or wrong values, so I can't give you specific numbers to use. Depending on the project and the scene you have every time, you play around depending on the result you are after. Moreover, I would like you to notice that our rendering is still being calculated, so we can add and adjust a layer while our rendering is being computed, or after it is cleared. It won't make a difference. And here you can see our render before and after the color corrections and effects applied. Before we finish with the layers, I would like to show you one more thing. You can repeat those layers more than once. So, if I click on the exposure layer, you see that our highlight burn is set to 0. So, it can't go any lower than that. But what we can do is add another exposure layer, and now we can reduce even more the highlights. When you don't need a layer, simply select it and choose Delete Selected Layers. V-Ray keeps all this info saved, so if I close the V-Ray frame buffer window, press Stop or Cancel, and hit the render button again, all this info will reapply on the next render. Render history allows us to save renders and compare them side by side in pairs of 2 or 4. This feature is useful especially when we are on the testing phase and we still try to figure out our solution. We have this rendering here that is being calculated. It is not finished yet, but that's fine. I can come here to the history panel and click on the first button, Save to History. A preview of the render will appear in the history panel. If we leave the cursor on the preview, details of the produced render appear, like the resolution of the render, the time needed to be computed, and the name of the 3ds Max file. We can right-click on the preview, choose Edit Node, and rename the preview title so that we remember what each render stands for in case we save many of them. Now, let's say that we are not sure whether we want to have the rug over here. I will click on the rug to select it, right-click and choose Hide Selection. I will produce one more render without the rug and click to save it to history. Now, there are 2 previews in the history panel. How can we compare these 2 renders? Click on the second button in the history toolbar, the A to B horizontal. Move the cursor to the right side of the first preview, and when you see the B letter, click on the render. This way, we set it as image B for the A to B comparison. Then, move the cursor to the left side of the second preview, and when you see the A letter, click on the render. So now that we have set which one is A and which one is B, you see that in the preview window, the 2 are divided in the middle by a slider. Click on the slider and move the cursor to the left or to the right. When we slide to the left, the B image unveils, while when we slide to the right, we see the A image. And so we compare them. If we want to delete a render saved in the history panel, simply select the render and press the delete button from the history toolbar. Now that we know how to use V-Ray frame buffer, the next step is to start exploring the rendering settings. Press F10 to open the render setup window. The menus adjust depending on the selected renderer. When we use V-Ray, the menus are the following: Common, V-Ray, GI, Settings, and Render Elements. As I mentioned at the beginning of this course, V-Ray has many rollouts and settings. I will focus only on the settings that I think are the most important to control the quality of your image and the rendering time. Let's start with the V-Ray tab. Go to the Global Switches rollout. In here, we are interested in the Hidden Lights setting. By default, this option is enabled and it means that the lights will be rendered regardless of whether they are hidden or not. When this option is disabled, any lights that are hidden will not be included in the rendering. Let's see how this works in action. Keep the default setting, which is that the hidden lights are enabled. Go to the camera viewport, select the floor lamp, right-click and choose Hide Selection. Hit the render button. So what do we notice here? That although the floor lamp is hidden, it still casts light and it looks so odd. But let me stop the render. If we go to the render setup dialog box, disable the hidden lights and do one more render, now it no longer casts light. My advice is to always have this option disabled, especially if you're a beginner, since while you're working on your project, you might hide lights while you do your testing, you will forget about them, and then you will get confused why you see illuminated areas where there are no lights. Let me now unhide the floor lamp. I can either right-click anywhere in the scene and choose Unhide All, or choose Unhide by Name and select from the list the items I want to unhide. Moving on to the image sampler anti-aliasing rollout. An image sampler, as its name implies, is an algorithm that samples the image, which means that it calculates the pixel's color. So, what happens during the sampling process? Let me do a crop render to the poof I have here. If I zoom in, what we see is the edge of the wooden part of the poof and the floor. And when we zoom in, we can see the pixels our render consists of. V-Ray will get one sample of this brown pixel of the wood and one sample of the grey pixel of the floor, and will average those two, which means create a pixel which is a blend of half the brown color and half the grey, and produce this one. Then it will get 50% of this color plus 50% of that color and produce this one. So, the more samples we ask V-Ray to use, the more accurate the final coloring of our scene will be. One of the purposes of sampling is also to improve anti-aliasing. You see this term in the title as well. What is anti-aliasing? When we draw a straight line using any software, AutoCAD, Photoshop, 3ds Max, etc., if this line is horizontal or vertical, it appears as a perfect line. But if this line is at an angle, then you can see the pixels it consists of. Going back to our example, anti-aliasing is basically the process of smoothing the edge to make it look like a curve and not have staggered edges. How does V-Ray smooth the edges? By adding extra pixels. When does it add extra pixels? When we increase our samples. So you would normally ask now, since we get a clean, smooth render only when we use many samples, then why don't we just do that? And the answer is because of the rendering time needed. I have prepared these two renders from the coffee table of our scene. In the left image, I have used a small number of samples, while in the right image, I have used many samples. So what do we notice? That when we use a few samples, noise, this grainy effect, is present in our render, while when we have many samples, the render looks smooth and clean. But it took approximately 1 minute for the left image to be calculated, while the right image needed 5 minutes. So, when I increased the samples, the rendering time increased by 5 times. What I advise you to do is to use a few samples when you do your testing, and once you are satisfied and ready to produce the final renders, then increase the samples to get a smooth result. Otherwise, your testing phase will last many hours. Of course, the rendering time I mentioned is relevant to your computer specifications, and if you have a really strong PC, the same render might need just a few minutes, but still, if you use draft renders, then it will last for a few seconds. And again, during the testing phase, you just want to speed up your process. Going back to our render setup window, V-Ray offers two methods for image sampling: the bucket and the progressive. The progressive sampler is the default one and renders the entire image progressively in passes, like this. In every pass you see here, the image as a whole gets clearer and clearer. Now, let's select the bucket. The bucket sampler subdivides the image into rectangular sections called buckets. The buckets render the image piece by piece. Do you see it here? These are the buckets, and every bucket gets fully clear before or while it moves to the next one. No matter which sampler you will choose, they both do the same thing, just following a different process. Let's now see each image sampler more in depth. Let's select the progressive sampler and go to the progressive image sampler rollout. The minimum and maximum subdivisions control the minimum and maximum number of samples that each pixel in the image receives. I always keep the default values of 1 and 100, which is a good number of samples, and I play around with the other two parameters. The render time sets the rendering time in minutes. When this number of minutes is reached, the render stops no matter the level of noise at that point. For instance, I will set it to 1 and produce a render. The render will be calculated for 1 minute and then it will stop, and I will get this result. The noise in the image is pretty high. Now, I will set the render time to 5 minutes to compare it to the previous render. The noise level is reduced, but it is still present in the render. The more we increase the time, the more passes we add to the rendering process, and so the cleaner our result will get. V-Ray has a very helpful feature called V-Ray Denoiser. It detects areas where noise is present in the render and smooths them out. To add V-Ray Denoiser, go to Render Setup. Select the Render Elements tab and click the Add button. From the Render Elements window, select V-Ray Denoiser and click OK. I will produce another render. Once the rendering passes are completed, you will see an additional process in the rendering window, the denoising. So now, although we kept the 5 minutes of rendering time, the result we get is smooth thanks to V-Ray Denoiser, who smartly blurs out the noise. If you set the render time to 0, then V-Ray will focus on the noise threshold. This setting controls the noise of the image. 0.005 is a good noise threshold and it usually removes the scene's noise and gives a clean image. But it can render for a long time depending on your computer. If this is 0, the entire image is sampled uniformly until either the maximum subdivisions value is reached or the render time limit is reached. So basically, V-Ray gives priority to the first of those settings that will reach its standards. I would recommend that during the testing phase, when you will have to render multiple times, to keep the rendering time low and if you wish add V-Ray Denoiser to make it look smooth. Once you are ready for the final render, increase the rendering time. And in any case, you can hit the stop button in the rendering window at any time and the render will be stopped before resolving completely. Now, let's see the bucket sampler. Go to the image sampler anti-aliasing rollout, select bucket, and then go to the bucket image sampler rollout. Let's go and disable V-Ray Denoiser for a while. So go back to the Render Elements tab, select V-Ray Denoiser and press Delete. Let's start by disabling the maximum subdivisions and producing a render. When we disable the maximum subdivisions, noise will be present through the whole render due to poor sampling. Let's save this in history. Now, enable back the maximum subdivisions. The default value is set to 24, which is a good number of samples to produce a render without noise. For my testing, I usually set it to 4 to speed up the rendering process. So let's type 4 and render. Let's also save this in history. So the noise is reduced but still present in the render. Let's now go and add V-Ray Denoiser. Let's do one more render. So now our render looks smooth. It's not perfect, but it's a good result, especially for the testing phase. I said earlier that V-Ray has a default value of 24 here. That's what the software suggests to get a clean render. So let me put 24 and render. Now you see that with maximum subdivisions at 24, we get a render with no noise, but the rendering time was too long, while with the 4, the rendering time was really fast. 24 maximum subdivisions usually require a substantial amount of rendering time. So even for my final renders, I will first try 8 to see if I get a clean render with this value, or 12, and if I don't, then I will go to the 24 subdivisions. To sum up with the image sampler, I personally use the progressive method, and that's because I can see a render very quickly and then let it refine for as long as necessary as additional passes are being computed. For my draft renders, I set the minimum subdivisions to 1, maximum to 100, the rendering time to 5 minutes, and noise threshold to 0.01. And I also add V-Ray Denoiser. So I basically do 5-minute test renders. But as we said earlier, you can also set the render time to 0 and stop the rendering process at any time. For my final renders, I set minimum and maximum subdivisions to 1 and 100, the render time to 0, and the noise threshold to 0.005. Let me highlight it one more time. You don't have to wait until the render stops by itself, because with these settings it might take several hours. You can stop the rendering process at any time you see that your image is clean and that you are satisfied. The advantage of the bucket sampler is that it requires less RAM, but the main disadvantage is that because it uses buckets, if you stop the rendering process, it will only clear the buckets that were calculated thus far, so you can't really use that render. But if you're a beginner and you find the progressive method may be complicated on when to stop the render, then feel free to use the bucket sampler and set for your draft renders minimum subdivisions to 1 and maximum to 4, and for your final renders make those value 1 and 12. V-Ray suggests that you should use 24 in the maximum subdivisions, and they are right because you will get a clean render with the 24, But for me it takes too much time, so I prefer to use 8 or 12 in combination with V-Ray denoiser. I hope that I have made it clear how the image samplers work, so let me move on to the GI tab. GI stands for Global Illumination and is a group of algorithms that are used to add more realistic lighting to a 3D scene. Global illumination is basically the indirect illumination. To understand how indirect lighting works, go to the GI tab and open the Global Illumination rollout. Uncheck the Enable GI and produce a render. What happened? The scene got darker because now we only have direct illumination. So we have the sunlight that comes in the room and hits this area. We have the ceiling lights that cast light over here, some LED lights and the floor lamp. When we enable the GI, the indirect lighting, the light spreads in the room by bouncing on the surfaces, so part of the sunlight gets absorbed by the floor and another part bounces and hits the other surfaces in our scene. And this bouncing continues until all the light rays are absorbed. The primary engine is used to compute the first light bounce, and the secondary engine is used to compute any subsequent bounces. I use here the default settings, which are brute force for the primary engine and light gas for the secondary engine. I do not adjust any of the settings here. Brute force is locked to 3 bounces, while if you go to the light gas rollout, you can play around with the subdivisions, but 1000 is a good number both for your testing and your final renders. If I go to the Render Elements tab, I have already talked about V-Ray denoiser. I always use it to smooth out my result, especially when I use a small number of samples. There is one more element that I want you to add, the V-Ray light mix. Click on the Add button and from the Render Elements list, choose V-Ray light mix and press OK. I will go into depth about this render element when we will talk about the lighting of our scene, so be patient for now. That's all on the rendering settings we use with V-Ray. I hope that now you understand what its setting means and how to adjust it. I left the Common tab last because it contains commands that are general and don't really affect the photorealistic result, but it is a really important tab as well, so let's go and see it. Go to the Common Parameters rollout. When we do still images, renders, we want the option Single to be selected. The other 3 refer to animation, which this course doesn't cover. Go to the Area to Render section. When View is selected, this means that the entire viewport will be rendered. Click on View and from the drop-down menu, select Region. A white rectangle appears in the active viewport. Click on the handles to adjust the size of this rectangle. Anything that is inside this region will be rendered, while anything that is outside will not render and will remain as it was before. Let me adjust the size to include only the coffee table and hit Render. The area outside the region remains untouched and V-Ray only renders the coffee table area. So region can save us lots of rendering time when we test specific areas of our scene where we don't have to render the full viewport. When region is enabled, actually when this rectangle is enabled, if we try to select objects in the scene, we can't. We are locked to this rectangle to only adjust its size. In order to unlock, either click this X button you see here or right-click anywhere outside the box. Now we can go and select objects again. But we can see that V-Ray saves our selection, so if I hit render, it will only render what is in this region, which is the coffee table. If we want to adjust the region, we will go to the render setup window, to the area to render, and although here it says region, we will click and reselect region. Now the handles are again enabled and we can change the size of the region. Let's go back to the area to render and now choose crop. Crop and region do exactly the same, which means that they will both render what is inside the box. The difference is that the region keeps untouched anything outside the box, while crop won't even display it. More specifically, hit render. Now, only what is inside the box renders and the remaining scene, let's say, disappears. Go back to the area to render and now choose blow up. Blow up and crop do exactly the same, which means that they will both render what is inside the box, without showing what is outside the box. The only difference is that when we use blow up, we can't change the ratio of the box. To be honest, I never use blow up. Go back to the area to render and now choose selected. Unfortunately, this option doesn't work with V-Ray. What it should be doing is, when we select an object from our scene and hit render, to only render our selection, making the remaining of the scene black. But as I said, it doesn't work with V-Ray, so if we choose selected and hit render, it's like we have the view option. It will render the full viewport. But V-Ray offers us another way to render only selected objects. Let me put back here the view option and go to the V-Ray tab and to the image sampler anti-aliasing rollout. In the render mask setting, click on none and choose selected. And let me quickly go and make the coffee table a white color. If I now select the coffee table and render, it leaves the remaining scene untouched and only renders the selected object, which is the coffee table. But this option mainly works only if you want to change materials, because if, let's say, I want to move this table slightly to the right and re-render, you see the trace of the old table here and the new position that now renders. So for me, it gets a bit confusing. In general, I personally prefer to use either view to render the full viewport or crop to do cropped images. Don't forget to go back, click on selected and make it none so that you will be able to render again the full viewport. Let's go back to the Common tab. And now we will see the output size. This section is an important part of the composition. It describes the proportions of the render that we will produce. We can do one of the following. From the drop-down menu, select one of the real-world output sizes or choose Custom and type in the width and height fields the desired values. Choose one of the template ratios on the right side. Type the desired image aspect. Now, let me explain to you more these values. For the viewport to adjust to the select ratio, we need to enable Show Save Frames. To do so, click Shift F or click the camera's viewport name label, this one, V-Ray Cam 001, and turn on Show Save Frames from the drop-down menu. These are the save frames, and what is inside them will render. So if I click on these arrows and scroll up or down, I can increase or decrease the size. I can make it more of a square size. Or go to the image aspect and type 1 so that the width is equal to height. When I want to post a render on my Instagram profile, I always choose to render square to fit perfectly. In this case, doesn't do justice to my design, so I would rather decrease the height of the window. When you like the width to height ratio, it's good to click on this lock icon next to the image aspect. This way, I can now type a value in the width field, let's say 2000, and the height value automatically adjusts. For my draft renders, I usually try values of 800 pixels width, and for my final renders, 2500 pixels. If I want to print the renderings, then I usually put 4200 pixels width unless my clients ask for a specific dimension. Please always have the show safe frames enabled, otherwise you will get confused why you see other things in your viewport and other are being rendered. Let's scroll down and find the render output section. I personally prefer to automatically save my renders once they are computed. To do so, click on the Files button to choose where you want your render to be saved and enable the Save File checkbox. Otherwise, you can click on the Save button and save your render. That's all with the rendering settings. I know, guys, that this was actually the most boring part because it has a lot of theory, but now that you know how to render, we are ready to do some fun stuff.